So shall I make a start then, Ray?
Yes, please.
I thought if I talked for sort of 10 or 15 minutes to start with, if you've got a sort of something you just want to clarify or a burning immediate question, do ask me. But otherwise, you might perhaps want to wait till the end and then ask questions. Okay, so I mean, first of all, a big thank you for inviting me to come today. Really welcome that. And like I've been saying, and Ray was mentioning, I'm going to share my thoughts about a new vision for people given mental health diagnoses. And that's because for many of us, the current mental health system doesn't work all that well. And I'm someone who's used it myself. So part of my vision is based on the fact that I think there's some radical changes that would be really good to see happening. So just to sort of recap with the approach usually taken to people experiencing mental trauma, obviously that mostly is to give us a psychiatric diagnosis and then clinical input, which very often, yes, does involve psychiatric drugs. And I guess another key part of my experience, and I guess from what most of you are saying may ring bells with your experience as well, we're often seen as people who are at risk of harming ourselves or others, and often not capable of making decisions. And that, of course, is why we can be detained in psychiatric hospitals and treated against our will, again, very often with psychiatric drugs. And that's why, of course, why there are community treatment orders where someone has to agree to certain conditions if they leave hospital. So all that obviously is to do with the Mental Health Act 1983. And I guess you may all also know that there are plans to reform that act. No, there was a review of the act, which goes actually right back to, I think, 2018, chaired by a psychiatrist. Then there was a fairish amount of delay while the government sort of looked at it and thought about it. And then a white paper was brought out at the beginning of this year. And again, there was a sort of consultation about that. I have to say that the report I then saw from the government on the consultation did a bit seem to leave out some of the more challenging statements that some of us made. But I guess we're kind of familiar with that from other government documents. And I mean, in a nutshell, the white paper basically upholds the mental health system, but it does look at reducing detentions and forced treatment, although not at getting rid of those. And I think the thinking behind that is that detention and forced treatment are, an act of care for people who aren't very good at looking after themselves. So that's the government thinking. And obviously a huge amount is still going on at the moment, not least the resurgence of COVID under the new variant. But at the moment, we're told that the Mental Health Act will be preceded by a mental health bill around next May. So it's a bit of a case of wait and see. A bit worryingly, the government isn't planning to have any legal scrutiny of the bill. So that is a bit worrying because, that's usually a stage when things that are problems can get ironed out, at least to an extent. But I'm going to move on to why I have quite a lot of problems with the medical model. And that does rest very much on my own experiences, and I fully respect the fact that everyone's different. But again, and I think this does tally with what some of you have been saying, it really does seem that the root of a large amount of mental distress is to do with factors in society. So like, yes, poverty, poor housing, difficulties with opportunities for education and employment for quite a part of society, the benefit system, which obviously has caused a lot of people considerable distress because of the hoops you have to go through, and the fact that it actually isn't really covering as much as it needs to. Then yes, issues to do with climate change, which often affect, people who are most deprived worse. So, if you've got poor housing, for example, you're more likely to get flooded. And then there are all the issues around, different forms of violence and abuse which happen. So for me, those are very, very relevant. And I guess for me, that's been highlighted even more during the COVID pandemic, because not surprisingly, the pandemic itself, but also the conditions that we've had to live under and the losses which many people have experienced has resulted in, the major increase in mental distress and mental trauma. But that clearly, again, is, because of what's going on for people at the moment. And then for me as well, there's a further issue, which is where people face more than one form of disadvantage, then you may particularly likely experience mental distress, mental trauma. So, for example, I'm thinking of the fact that, it's now very clear, sadly, that the level of abuse against women is very high. There also, despite the government's report, there are major issues for people who belong to Black and minority ethnic communities, racialised communities, but also, of course, a lot of challenges for young people, and a wide range of those of us who are older. So, from my point of view, psychiatric diagnoses and putting us in institutions rather than dealing with the fundamentals falls well short of what we actually need. And I mean, I've been very interested in some of the things that I've been sort of finding out about psychiatry. One is that psychiatric diagnoses are not nearly as soundly based as they're said to be. I mean, obviously, if you're depressed, you'll know you are, but that's, that's being depressed is also very much a part of sort of human condition, human life. But whereas with diagnosis for physical health problems, there actually is, considerable evidence. There isn't actually the same evidence base for psychiatric diagnoses. And what's also coming out, of course, is that psychiatric drugs can be helpful and effective short term, but they may well not make a huge amount of difference, sort of long term. So it does seem likely that the sort of failure to deal with social causes and the lack of recognition of some of the flaws in psychiatry are behind the fact that psychiatry as a medical profession is not doing very well. So there are more and more drugs sort of coming out, but actually the success rate of psychiatry is not very impressive. And I'd also really want to highlight, to me, sort of damage that I think has been caused by the mental health system. Certainly that was my experience, particularly if you're sectioned. So I mean, my experience certainly of being sectioned and locked up was it was incredibly traumatizing. The last thing you want is to be sort of dragged off to hospital when you're in a very bad state and feels, as if you're being sort of locked up. And what I wanted, and I guess a lot of people do, is the exact opposite, a very warm, homely sort of setting where you feel a person and you feel people are treating you, in a very humane way. People who really listen, spend time with you, ask what would help instead of assuming that, you haven't any meaningful views. And so, you should automatically accept forced treatment. And, I guess another of the problem I've got with the sort of medical system is that it is very much based on the idea that we're often either a risk to other people or a risk to ourselves. The reality is that we're far more likely to be abused or actually killed by other people than anything that we might do. So I guess for me, we need a government that tackles the injustices in society, not one that sees distress and trauma as just an individual problem, where you've got a sort of chemical imbalance. And of course, I guess being a little bit sort of cynical for government, if you see mental distress and trauma as a purely individual problem, you actually don't have to take the major steps that need taking to address, all the problems in society that are causing distress, because that does mean radical change. I mean, the other argument is that it would cost a lot more. I think that's arguable because at the moment, distress arising from those sort of factors is causing an ever-increasing bill, sort of the NHS, and the cost of sort of keeping people in hospital is phenomenal. My guess is that if you really tackle the root causes, and if you used community resources really effectively, that the costs wouldn't necessarily be sort of much more major. So what I've been very interested in is a UN convention. Again, I don't know whether you'll have heard of this or not, but it's the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Is that sort of familiar? Yeah, getting one nod. That convention covers people in mental distress and trauma as well. The UK government has signed up to it, and that's, therefore part of a legal treaty it's made, but it hasn't actually essentially implemented it in domestic law, nor in the approach that it takes. But basically that convention puts a major focus on social factors. It sort of uses what you might call a sort of social model of disability. And it also recognises that, a clinical model is only one model, and therefore strongly questions, that being the dominant model. The other part of that sort of convention, which really appeals to me, is the emphasis on people given mental health diagnoses having the same human rights as anyone else. So, for example, it strongly endorses moving away from a model of making decisions for us, and instead putting in the warm human listening kind of approach, which so often actually does enable people to say what they would really find helpful. And it also calls for an end to coercion, so detention, hospital, forced treatment, community treatment orders. That's partly a recognition of the damage which that's caused for a lot of us. I mean, again, there've been worrying figures about the number of people who actually commit suicide once they've left hospital. And it's also because when we're detained like that, it's on the basis of potential risk. And of course, no one else is locked up on potential risk. You have to have actually done something. So what the convention put its emphasis on is independent living in the community with the support that's needed for that, and the opportunity, to be a full part of the community. And it's based on the idea that where we might be thought of as different, that shouldn't result in discrimination and, approach where you're segregated in institutions. And I guess it also strongly recognises that, actually because of our experiences, we've got a lot of insights and strengths and skills to contribute to society, which often are getting lost at the moment. The government, nonetheless, is keeping very closely to the clinical model, and that's why the white paper is essentially still rooted in that. So what I've also done is I've set up a group called Liberation, and we work in a grassroots kind of way. Members are people who do support the UNCRPD, and it's a group which is open to people with their own experience of mental distress or trauma as direct members. And obviously that very often is people who've been through the psychiatric system. But there's also associate membership for people who are enthused about the UN Convention, but don't have personal experience of distress. And what we do is we operate in England, but we do also have members from the rest of the UK and other countries. And that's because, it's really enriching to sort of hear what's going on in other countries, and actually to work with colleagues internationally on promoting, hopefully, a very different approach to mental distress and trauma. So that's what I really wanted to say. And again, sort of thanks for listening. And what would be great is we could now open it out to discussion. So, share views of what you think, questions that you may have. I don't know whether you're sort of chairing this bit, Ray, or whether I just sort of respond to people as they say things.
I was just going to say, but to ask people to comment. But Graham, you wanted to comment there.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. If you were Secretary of State for Health, what would you put in the white paper and the act which will come next year? And how far would your contribution copy best practice in other countries?
Yes, some key things I put in is an emphasis on us being treated as sort of full citizens, the same as anyone else. I'd put a particular emphasis on recognition for people who experience more than one form of disadvantage, and where both or triple things are behind sort of distress. I'd put a very strong focus on putting the resources into the community and sort of proper support there, as opposed to pouring money into hospitals where so often you're just getting a kind of revolving door. For community resources, I'd also put in a really wide range of resources. So as well as, there being a clinical model still available, the various other sort of approaches which can help people a lot. So peer support, much more funding for groups like the Hearing Voices Network, which takes a very sort of non-clinical approach to experience of hearing voices. Lots more opportunities just to join in the everyday community things that make a real sort of difference to you. And again, very much looking at the fact that you can't actually change the high level of mental distress without actually addressing the sort of underlying causes. So I guess those are some of the sort of key things that I'd put in. Could you give me the other half of your question now?
Well, it really follows up from that and asks, in what other countries, perhaps in Europe, are these practices different from the standard treatment in this country? So what evidence is there to back your case for a more radical approach by this government next year?
I mean, what sort of, I'd have to say Europe itself isn't a brilliant example. Some of the countries that are further forward are outside Europe. I mean, Peru has been doing some quite exciting work. Just recently, Japan has. But basically, there are lots of sort of pockets of practice, things like sort of crisis houses people can use, therapeutic communities very often run by people who've got their own experience of distress. Sweden has got a very innovative supported decision-making scheme where people are helped to sort of make a decision as opposed to having decisions made for them, even where, you know, it seems like a lot of people are saying, well, it'd be impossible for that person to make a decision. They're being quite sort of innovative. In Japan, interestingly, the Japanese lawyers are now essentially coming down against detention and forced treatment, and they're actually looking to see how the law could be changed to accommodate that. With alongside that, of course, you know, the massive increase in community resources that would be needed. One of the problems is because the clinical model is so dominant, you know, it's very, very much so in Europe, but it's also true of quite a lot of other countries. Alternative groups are not getting funding, therefore they may not exist, or it's very difficult to get the research evidence done that shows they're working better. So there's a lot of evidence from people, you know, who've used the service saying, you know, at long last, this has helped me. But obviously what you need to convince governments is sort of formal research. And most research money, certainly in the UK, is going into clinical research, not research into other options. There's there are one or two hospitals that have been trying to offer services which don't depend on medication. So that's sort of also happening. There's something in Iceland called Open Dialogue, which is beginning to get a bit of a hearing. And that again is meeting with the person themselves and their support networks and seeing how things can be resolved through that approach rather than through giving someone a label or you know, just going very quickly to medication, which sort of often happens. The other thing that's very interesting is that the World Health Organization, they do actually keep essentially a clinical model in terms of looking at diagnoses, but they've actually come out strongly now saying the resources need to go into the community, that they oppose detention and forced treatment. So, I mean, that's sort of quite a landmark change of stance and really encouraging.
Do you know of the experience of Rufus May, and is he a member of Liberation?
No, he's not. He's someone I haven't been in touch. Yeah, no, I mean, I might well write to him because he'd be a brilliant person to have involved. Yeah, no, thanks for that, because I'm kind of, at the moment, I'm running Liberation, like I said, very much on as a grassroots group, but alongside that, I haven't actually got any funding at the moment. So, you know, I have to kind of do what I can in the time that I can. And, you know, some of the members are also very generous in helping. But again, it very much sort of illustrates the point that, you know, if you're trying to break an existing sort of pattern, clinical approach, you know, it's much, much harder to sort of get the resources.
The the medical health profession has always, as far as I remember, always been known as the Cinderella service, with because of the funding and the shortage of staff and other type of stuff like that. You know, I've been studying that type of thing for years, I think. The other thing I would say is the medical model is known to clinicians and to MPs because it is easier to understand. It is this, and if that you throw drugs at it, basically, you know. But with the politicians, it is not just easier to understand, it's financially far less likely to succeed, because if you have the social model, you have to improve communities, build better housing, reopen youth centres and community centres, and engage more people in that. And that costs time and money, which they, in a lot of cases, aren't willing to spend on the subject.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I fully recognise that mental health services have been underfunded. I think the problem for me, though, is when there's any issue of more funding, it's going into further clinical services, whereas some of it could undoubtedly be going to community services and other approaches. My only experience with MPs is I just don't think they understand anything except a medical model. I think it's partly because mental health law, and now actually the white paper, is very much promoted on the basis of MPs have got a sort of duty of care to look after us. Now, why coercion should be seen as a form of care, I don't actually quite understand. You know, it certainly doesn't feel caring. But I think they sort of feel they're doing the best for people in mental distress and are just not used to any other model. And yes, like any large group, the government is very resistant to change. You know, large organisations, quite apart from groups like the government, don't change readily because it does, like you're saying, Ray, mean a lot of sort of time and effort. And again, I wouldn't want in any way to be, you know, sort of political, but I think it would be fair to say that the current government hasn't got the greatest focus on sort of social justice for everyone. And we're not sort of trying to say that in a party or political kind of way, but, you know, I think it's not on their agenda.
It is a multi-political thing.
Sorry. Sorry, I could hear someone saying something. Was that Susan saying what she put in the chat about having to drop out for a minute? Or
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm a bit cynical also into the understanding that maybe a bit more cynical than yourself in this regard, that a lot of MPs are slightly in the pocket of Big Pharma. You know?
Yeah.
Sell lots of drugs.
No, I'd really agree with you, and that's sort of another problem. And psychiatrists themselves are a very, very sort of powerful group, and given that, like I said, large groups don't sort of change readily, you know, I think they have very much got the ear of the government. And, you know, it actually was no surprise that a psychiatrist was put in charge of the review I mentioned, the one that led up to the white paper. Interestingly, in Scotland, you know, they're actually not using a psychiatrist to chair the review, which is now also happening in Scotland. And interestingly, they are also talking about taking the UN CRPD into account. You know, how fully that will be, I think, is yet to be seen. Whereas the psychiatrist who chaired the review in England he made it very, very, very clear right the way through that that the UNCRPD is absolutely anathema to him, and he didn't want to have any truck with it, which kind of made it a bit difficult for those of us who were trying to say, look, could we look at a whole variety of perspectives? Other sort of things, I mean, sort of reflections, thoughts, questions.
Has Deliberation got a website?
Not yet. Unfortunately, the person who was doing it for me had to stop. I've got information sheets about it, but unfortunately, I now need to find someone who can get the website sort of up and running. I don't actually have those skills. I mean, kind of my IT skills are quite basic. So, but no, I mean that's very much in the pipeline because we do badly need one. Yeah, Christopher.
Yes. Now, I do realise that I dozed off for a moment or two, so you may have spoken about this, but I thought I'd just share a bit of my experience. Although I found my GPs willing to listen, I must admit, I don't think their diagnostic skills in mental health are as good as they could be, even those who've done special training, because I've come to the conclusion that, I started off on drugs for the depression because that's what they, because I wanted to kill myself, and I thought that was making me anxious, whereas it was actually the anxiety that I think was causing the depression. I've worked out after many years. And now that I'm on medication that does particularly help with anxiety, I found that quite helpful. I think I'm one of the lucky ones that, medication has and continues to help. The other thing is, I think, as with a lot of things, the treatment gets very faddy at times. I mean, I've had a lot of, cognitive behavioral therapy, and I must admit that although it's slightly useful, I haven't found it as, as good as they think. I mean, basically, I think because, well, they're assuming that, the things that are terrifying me, it's all in my mind, which it definitely is. But I didn't feel it was being taken seriously, and if only I'd go through the proper steps, it would all go away, which I didn't find it did. So, and of course that went from, having individual counselling to being in a group thing, which actually was quite interesting because you could see that other people in the group were having exactly the same sort of anxieties as I was, but in different areas. But apart from that, and then I think the last lot I went to, it was just, you know, kind of telling you, well, this is how it works, you know, go away and try it on yourself, which I know that, you know, cuts in the funding all the time, but, you know, it is very difficult. And I know, you know, a friend of mine who had manic depression, which many friends here will have known quite well. She died a year or two ago now, but she was on lithium for many years and then had to come off it because it had done great deal of damage to her kidneys, and was put on other drugs, which I don't think ever worked as well. But I mean, we talked about it, and she recognized that, in fact, if she hadn't have been on that, she'd have been, you know, because before she had that, she was having to be hospitalized every couple of years because things got so bad. So yeah, I think I get the feeling that, you know, a lot of the people working in this area are doing as well as they can, but and of course, one of the interesting things in recent times is with all these modern scanners, they can actually tell which part of your brain is being, you know, is active when, you know, certain thoughts or feelings are going through your mind. And in fact, I saw somebody privately a while ago, and you know, she was very skillful and clever, because just at one stage she just snapped and said, "You're making up stories again." And I realized that I was, you know, all this, you know, anxiety was I was building it all up in my mind from, you know, yeah, next to nothing. But you know, it's very very difficult, I think, coming to terms, I think, particularly as I was brought up with, you know, well, you know, you might not be strong like others, but you've got a very good brain. And so I tend to think I should be able to think my way out of my problems. And of course, you know, I've now reached a stage where I realize that sometimes my brain's just telling me, you know, lies, you know, you know, suicide is not the best option. You know, a bar of chocolate will do far more good. So anyway, sorry, I've rambled on a bit. I'll be quiet for a while.
No, not at all. No, I really valued what you said. And I mean, picking up some of it, I do agree that, you know, sometimes you can actually get a sense of what really is the problem in the way a professional sort of doesn't. So you said, you know, over time you came to realize that it was your anxiety causing your depression, sort of not the other way around. I mean, I very much agree that cognitive therapy may suit some people, but there are quite a lot of people it doesn't suit. And that's why, you know, at Liberation, we're trying to say, look, people need a variety of things, because what suits one person sort of doesn't suit another. And really, you know, the same point on medication, you know, not saying there isn't a place for medication, but saying, you know, everyone's different. And for some people, you know, it doesn't work well. And of course, there is a very worrying side of it, you know, which you've highlighted, that it does do a huge amount of physical damage. And again, I think I'd agree that quite a lot of people in mental health services are sort of doing their best. But I think the two issues, one is the training that people are being given, because it is quite narrow. Therefore, it's hard for people to offer, you know, a whole variety of things. But also, and I know this from talking with various workers myself, is workers are also feeling just so frustrated by the system themselves in a whole number of cases. And that's hard because, you know, if you're working in a system which basically isn't doing what you want it to be doing, but as a worker, you're caught in the system, you know, that is very difficult. And I mean, it's brilliant that, you know, you did find someone in counselling who you did actually find useful, because yeah, that's what people need, you know, sort of right thing for right person. So no, I really valued what you're saying. Certainly didn't feel you were in any way rambling.
You've reminded me of one of the first people I saw. He was actually a student, and he was, you know, he pointed out that I always seem to look on the, you know, black side of things. You know, I was never a person with a glass half full. It was always empty. You know, and somebody on the and he said, you know, I'd like you over the next week to try and think positively about things. So I was walking home and I thought, I was thinking, I do not know what he's talking about. How is it possible to do something like that? And I thought, and then I suddenly remembered Pollyanna, that horrible girl in that story. And so I thought, right, now what I must do is rechristen myself, Christopher Pollyanna Denman. And although sometimes they say using humor isn't helpful, I think that did help me, look and enjoy positive things far more than I had done in the past. So yeah, some people are very good, others less so. And yeah, tricky.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, that is a real issue, because then it does depend who you get, whether it's helpful or not. Anything from people who haven't said anything yet? I mean, no pressure at all if you prefer not to, but any other thoughts or reactions to what I said? Or
Well, this is just a comment, actually. I lived in New York, and if there was a problem in New York with your friends, you talked about it. Whereas here, at the time, this was the early 60s, you didn't, you denied it. And it did seem to me that what I would now call English hypocrisy of not actually talking about problems or issues is actually very unhelpful. I found living in New York very liberating in many, many ways.
yeah, I agree. And I think in this country, there's been, the tradition, I think it's a bit less prevalent, but, there's sort of step upper lip that people are supposed to keep. But also, I think despite everything that's been done, there is a huge amount of discrimination still, and people are afraid to open out. I mean, I know I once mentioned to someone I thought would be fine with it, that I'd used the mental health system, and she looked absolutely shocked. I think because she had a stereotype that I didn't come across the way you were supposed to come across if you used that system, and therefore she couldn't put the two together. But that was kind of worrying, because it meant she had a very negative view of what people who use the mental health system, in quotes, are like. So no, I do think it is. And then there's a whole issue of sort of job applications and things like that, where certainly my experience has been that you undoubtedly do face a harder job getting a job if you've ever been through the mental health system.
Yes, the hardest thing I think for people to understand is that mental health, like diseases, takes no prisoners. It can happen to anybody across all spectrums in life. And it's if we all remember the Victorian novels of the mad uncle or cousin who was shunned by society and is hidden away in differing places. But I think the 21st century, with the amount of publicity and other things, this is starting to be recognized more as something that happens to anybody, even pop stars, television stars, members of royalty, and all this lot of saying, yes, it happens to me as well. And maybe that helps. I don't know, but it's different.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping it does, because when it becomes more recognised as an everyday thing that, a huge amount of people go through, then hopefully there might be more recognition that some of the very everyday, ordinary things are what make the difference. Like, yes, feeling free to sort of chat with someone about what you're going through.
Any more friends?
Right, just another, sorry.
Graham?
Me or Graham?
Well, why don't we have Graham and then Christopher?
I think you've taken on an enormous challenge in changing the culture of the general population and of and members of Parliament and so on, in tackling the overemphasis on drug treatment and opening people's minds to a wider range of therapists. I just want to mention one other even more difficult problem, which is that of people in the criminal justice system. I went to the trial of an inoffensive little man some years ago who was convicted of an appalling murder of his partner, totally inexplicable. He had successfully disengaged from relationships in the past. This relationship appeared to be perfectly normal and satisfactory. And in the course of the trial, actual sounds of the murder were broadcast to the jury for 10 minutes, and I'm sure that strongly influenced them. On the defense side, there was a psychiatrist who described how she had interviewed this man who happened to mention in the course of the conversation that he was hearing voices telling him that this woman had to be killed. Now, I doubt whether any member of the jury had any experience of people hearing voices. And of course, they had in their minds memories of the screams of this woman victim going on for 10 minutes. So my friend was convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment, and I think he's still in prison now. I was very unhappy about the verdict and the way in which the jury had been manipulated in order to get a conviction. Now, there have been other more or less inexplicable murders recently, particularly of young children. And you think, in how many of these cases should the case be treated as a problem of mental illness rather than one of 100% evil requiring that kind of sentence? And of course the expense, some £50,000 a year to keep a person in prison. But I hesitate to suggest that you should get involved with this because emotions are held so strongly that, you know, if a child dies, then prison is seen as the only possible way forward.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very difficult one, and I can't sort of, as it were, sort of specialize in the whole area, but I do try and pick it up as part of what I do. Again, what's quite worrying in the mental health white paper is that people who are in the criminal justice system are going to do even less well with any new rights that are in that than people as a whole. So there's a big sort of issue there. And again, I think it's very difficult because someone does have the right to a trial, just as you do if you haven't got a mental health diagnosis. But yes, I completely agree that the system isn't fair to people who are in the psychiatric system, because it's just not, I mean, the sort of, quite apart from prejudice that may exist in the way things are handled, the sort of reasonable adjustments that people need in order to be able to access the system meaningfully so often just aren't there. I mean, there's a voluntary group called Wish that tries to pick up the issues, but no, it's the way the whole system works. So yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if we got just a minute or two more, because Christopher was going to come in.
Yes, I think, well, I think one of the things in my experience that often things are triggered when life doesn't turn out like I hope it's going to, or, you know, a great disappointment. And I do wonder whether perhaps in our education or upbringing that perhaps more ought to be done to help us deal with disappointment. And can I just say one thing about murderers, which some years ago, a friend, I think she's left Quakers since then, but she worked in the prison service and worked with murderers. And she said, you know, very nice men on the whole. It's just that, you know, there was this occasion when they lost their temper. And, you know, completely lost it. Again, something we're not trained to deal with, I don't think. But yeah, anyway, right.
No, it's a whole huge area in its own right.
It is, yeah.
Mm.
So, right, well, we won't go into that. Now, Ray asked me to close the meeting if he had to go. So can I check, is there anything that anybody's burning to say, or are we? Right, that's a no then, because they haven't said so. Well, thank you very much, Dorothy. We very much appreciated having you this morning. And it's been a very interesting hour. Next week, well, you know, after the Lord Mayor's show, you've got me and sharing comic poetry. So if you're not dashing around or traveling away and fancy spending time in my company, that's what's happening next Friday. Okay, and I shan't be offended if nobody comes, so I'm probably not offended if you do come either. So right, okay, bye everybody, and thank you again, Dorothy. It's been,
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you. Bye.